Well, hello, my name is Daniel. This is a presentation I gave just yesterday at the Sacred Arts in a Pluralistic Society conference here in Vancouver, BC, based on a longer paper which I gave as part of my concentration in arts and Christianity at Regent College. It's a long presentation, it's actually in four parts. And it's on this piece of sculpture, this artwork, which I find very captivating, made by the artist Mark Wallinger. So, by depicting Christ as an ordinary human whose life-size stature is made minuscule by the surroundings, Mark Wallinger's Ecce Homo, displayed on Trafalgar Square's fourth plinth in 1999, succeeds in making Christ strange again. Now, just to pause for a moment and point out our surroundings here. This is Trafalgar Square at the heart of London. The National Gallery is at the top and Nelson's Column is at the bottom. Surrounding the fountain on four sides, you'll notice four smaller sculptures on plinths, and the three of these sculptures were made about 100 and 150 years ago to commemorate generals and kings, and they're massive. They're much larger than life size. But then the fourth plinth, which is the one in the top left corner, is empty. It's remained empty ever since this was planned, and the reason is that they ran out of money to make the sculpture that they had planned. And it's remained empty for all this time, and around the turn of the millennium, the Arts Council decided to commission a series of temporary sculptures to fill that fourth plinth. And the first to be commissioned was one by artist Mark Wallinger, and you can see that sculpture, Ecce Homo, from afar, towering underneath the towering Nelson's Column. So, this sculpture, I believe, succeeds in making Christ strange again, and I will explore in this presentation four ways that Wallinger's piece does this. First, by rebuking power. Second, by confronting bystanders. Fourth, by challenging secularism. And finally, by depicting the scandal of the incarnation. So, part one, on rebuking power. The center of London from which all distances were measured, the suffering Christ as a rebuke of empire. Cast out of sanded polyester resin, which is durable in the English weather but looks like pure white marble, Wallinger's statue depicts a man who stands naked except for a strip of fabric tied loosely around his waist like a towel. The details of his exposed body are strikingly beautiful, including the curve of his ankle bones, the lines of his hips, and the precision of his shoulder blades. The figure's muscles are defined, but not gym-hardened. His arms are tied behind his back, and this, combined with his lack of clothing, gives him a sense of passive vulnerability. Yet there's something about his posture and expression that speaks to an inherent dignity. He may be a captive, but he appears prepared and ready to meet his fate. With his shaven head and face, there's nothing in the figure itself to suggest that he is Christ Jesus. Rather, what identifies him is his gold-gilded crown of barbed wire thorns, which are the statue's only source of color. This twist of sharp wire appears on the figure's bald head like a painful halo, a reminder that this moment of defenseless suffering has an eternal purpose. Through the specific details of the figure's very human body and the modern-day barbed wire, the statue is grounded in the present. Yet the gold halo and the universality of the expression transforms it into a figure who transcends this moment in time. Now, to contemplate the statue without accounting for its surroundings would be to miss Wallinger's aim in creating the work. Art critic Adrian Streel states that with the statue, we must remember that the figure is only half of the work, for it is the figure in a setting that counts. When viewing photographs of the statue's original placement in Trafalgar Square, one is immediately struck by how tiny, fragile, and lonely Christ's life-size body appears against the grandeur and pomp which surrounds it. In an interview, Wallinger declared that the figure was made to look precarious from a great height, an effect he surely achieved. Scholar Cameron Cartery's description of the surroundings is apt. The figure is dwarfed by Nelson's column, a 185-foot granite column surmounted by a statue of Admiral Nelson, and the 3 bronze sculptures on the other plinths, which dominate the square. This interaction of the statue with its setting was part of Wallinger's intention, as Lynn Barber makes clear in her profile on the artist. He designed it for Trafalgar Square, and he very much wants it to stay there. Art critic Richard Dormant finds this intention successful, writing, "This disparity in scale between the plinth and the figure is, like the setting of Trafalgar Square, as important to the meaning of the work as the figure itself," adding that to take the statue away from this particular site would vitiate its impact. Part of this impact is the way that the sculpture, the artwork, contrasts with the imperial aims of the surrounding square. Columnist Simon Jenkins states that Trafalgar Square was in some sense the hub of the empire, and scholar Shanti Sumataro adds that its Victorian statuary, its layout, and its position in a larger central London landscape of imperial power all point to a monolithic and powerful version of the British nation and empire. Martin Herbert likewise describes the square as the center of London from which all distances were measured and where public executions used to take place. So, contrary to the opinion of art historian Sir Roy Strong, who said only people totally ignorant of the square's very definite theme could have chosen something so glaringly inappropriate, Wallinger is intentional with this contrast. He has stated, "I wanted a life-sized figure, a real person among the oversized relics of empire." In Wallinger's version of the Ecce Homo scene, the glory of the British Empire stands in for the cruelty of Rome, about to condemn a Jesus made fragile by his humanity. As another critic puts it, the realization that this figure of Christ is life-size makes the sheer bombast of the traditional sculptures nearby cruelly apparent. Wallinger has described this life-size Jesus as a kind of inversion of all the other statues in the square, which are like trophies and triumphant scenes of empire. His intention was also to bring to mind Christianity's complicity with this empire. Putting Jesus on a civic plinth is also a reminder of how much, in fact, Christianity has embraced power, since it is still, in some sense, our state religion. By placing this human-scale Jesus amongst all these imperial monuments, Wallinger exposes the forces of empire, including the self-declared Christian British Empire, as hollow and callous. Wallinger's critique of the destructive power of empire is radical because of the quiet power embodied in the frail figure of the life-size Jesus. Wallinger understands Christ's gospel of powerlessness, stating in an interview, "Christ is always an anomalous presence, a reject, a destabilizer, at odds with worldly values and powers, and, in his own humiliation and victimization, a rebuke to those powers." By placing this suffering, silent Christ at the very heart of the British Empire, Wallinger is maybe suggesting that there's another kind of power at work, even at the very heart of the modern-day British Empire. To highlight this contrast, one can compare the statue within its surroundings to Rembrandt's painting of the same scene, as art historian Nigel Halliday does in his coverage of the statue. In Rembrandt's Ecce Homo, which is housed in the nearby National Gallery, the artist invented a huge column with the bust of Caesar at the right, casting Jesus and Caesar in similar poses, so that one could draw the comparison between worldly power and glory, enshrined in stone but ultimately transient, and spiritual power and glory, enshrined in the flesh of the God-man of the eternal God-man. Yet, as Halliday points out, Wallinger does not have to invent the context. The other sculptures in the square create it for him. As a result, the bombastic depiction of military power and empire are rendered hollow by the quiet presence of the physically vulnerable but all-powerful God-man. And as I say, by placing this sculpture here at the center of London, Wallinger may be suggesting that there is another kind of power at work, even at the heart of the modern-day British Empire. Part 2. Shockingly ordinary. Reactions to Christ's presence in the square. The artwork interacts with its surroundings in another way too. It recruits bystanders to become the crowd who react to Jesus. The Ecce Homo motif has been used throughout art history, and although a few artists have portrayed a solitary Jesus, it's actually much more common to also depict the officials and the crowd's reaction to him. Here's just two examples, 400 years apart. Harmonius Bosch in the 15th century and Henri Deneur in the 19th century. Now, in contrast, as art critic Rebecca Hall writes, for Wallinger's Ecce Homo, the imperial square stands in for Pilate's palace, and the passing public occupies the role of the crowd. Wallinger himself has made it clear that this was his intention in the work, stating that it was important to me to make the point that my figure places the viewer in the crowd that did call for Christ's blood. Dormant, the art critic, understands this aim when he writes, by placing the statue high up on this enormous plinth, Wallinger implicates us as spectators in the drama, for as in a traditional passion play, we become participants in the unfolding narrative, taking the part of the mob baying for blood. Now, given Wallinger's frequent embrace of the performance art medium, he sucked helium on a soapbox in 1997's Hymn and dressed as a bear in Berlin in 2004's Sleeper. It's fitting that his first public sculpture incorporates this kind of interaction. As he states in another interview, we are all responsible. Looking at him, what singles you out from the crowd, from the mob? How would you react? Well, one reaction is simply to ignore Jesus, distracted by the culture and people that surround him. Dormant compares the statue to James Ensor's painting Christ's Entry into Brussels in 1889, which depicts exactly this. In that painting, the crowd is preoccupied by the surrounding pomp and fanfare and barely notice the tiny figure of Christ, whose halo and red robe are lost in the surrounding environment. You can see Christ there, the top center, dressed in red. Something similar might have happened when Wallinger's sculpture was displayed in the square during public festivities. As art historian Judith Collins reminds us, Ecce Homo stood in Trafalgar Square from the summer of 1999 to the early spring of 2000, and so was there for the revelers on Millennium Night, offering a silent reminder of what the millennium celebrated and was calibrated from. Perhaps some of these merrymakers noticed the figure of Jesus, but, as in Ensor's painting, surely many did not. Another reaction is to be offended by Wallinger's depiction of Jesus, and this reaction was recorded in newspaper accounts of the statue's unveiling, multiple accounts actually. I'm going to quote one from The Guardian. Felicia Gibbons details her conversation with two bystanders. Muscular Christians were queuing up to mock the pale, shaven-headed figure in a loincloth. If that's Jesus Christ, it's a bloody miracle, said Colin Duggan from Acton, West London, who had waited up all night for the statue to be put in place. You couldn't put your faith in someone like that. He's as weak as a kitten. What kind of a savior is he to someone like her? He added, pointing to a homeless girl sleeping on a bench. John Goodwin, another doubter, said, his smallness just shows what little meaning Christianity has in the world today. He's a typically broken, lily-livered Anglican Jesus. So Wallinger's Jesus thus confronts those who encounter him, forcing the question of whether we will accept the kind of salvation he offers. Ecce Homo also offends because it displaces over-familiar images of Jesus with a Christ who shocks us with his ordinariness. Wallinger has compared his statue to the same scene in Italian director Pier Paolo Pasolini's 1964 film The Gospel According to St. Matthew, explaining that this scene is so shockingly ordinary, I wanted some of that quality. This ordinariness is present in the statue's body. Several writers name this aspect of the statue, with Carteret stating, Wallinger's Christ is not a figure of mythic proportions, which did not stand heroic in its nakedness, or possess a gaze filled with compassion and knowing, as is so often depicted in classical sculpture. Critic Adrian Cyril likewise notes how the statue's near-naked body feels different from heroic depictions of nudity. The figure looks unclothed, not heroically naked, but undressed. Wallinger is clear that this was his intention, stating, I've always thought that the sculpture should be the image of a specific individual rather than a generalized figure. Another reason the statue shocks is Wallinger's decision to use the features of a contemporary man rather than maintain the facial features traditionally associated with Jesus. Dormant notices this when he writes, up close, what is most striking about the figure of Christ is that he has been given the face and body of a modern man. The marble resin is as prosaic as it is possible for a substance to be. The contemporaneity of the face is startling. Arts critic Robin Stringer agrees, writing, it is not the image of the Son of God with which we are familiar. Instead, this Christ is depicted without hair or beard and looks very much a modern man. A bearded, long-haired Christ with a heroic gaze and ripped, robed body would allow us to put some distance between him and us, but this contemporary Jesus forces us to recognize him as one of our own. And this recognition ought to make us uneasy, for this Christ reminds us of those in our society whom we may be most likely to dismiss. Dormant states this succinctly when he writes, Wallinger's Christ looks too much like someone we know for comfort. Surreal presses this discomfort even further. Christ's lack of muscle, his pallor and unfixable expression, his stillness inadvertently yet inescapably brings to mind a fashionable gay clubber on bondage night in ironic biblical drag. This comparison reminds us that this Christ could be anyone, even those in our society whom some religiously pious might consider furthest from the faith. I duplicated those slides, so I apologize. This Jesus also resembles those whom our Western society has brutalized, both in the past and in the present. In interviews, Wallinger has suggested comparisons with three groups of people: Jewish victims of the Holocaust, Black American lynching victims, and Muslims massacred in Bosnia. Regarding the first group, Wallinger has said, I couldn't help think about the fact that Christ was a Jew, and about the fate of the Jews in the 20th century. The lynching comparison comes from the artist stating, I wanted to show him as an ordinary human being who is being led out in front of a lynch mob. The lynch mob, of course, being the public who see the statue. Yet while these two historical examples of Western atrocities occurred in the first half of the 20th century, largely, Wallinger has also sought parallels with more recent slaughters. In an interview, he has stated, the work was conceived not long after Srebrenica. Srebrenica was where in July 1995 some 8,000 Bosnian Muslims were killed in cold blood by the Serbian army. which is the ghastliest massacre on European soil since the end of the Second World War. And that was entirely to do with nationalism, bigotry, all the things that would have applied in Judea. Ecce Homo, then, was at once Jesus Christ and a contemporary political prisoner, head shaving being habitually a part of the modern humiliation. It dangled the question, are we going to condemn someone to death for religious differences? And as suggested, given how late the West acted on Bosnia, that in some ways we already had. The shorn head and barbed wire of Ecce Homo's Jesus is a reminder that political prisoners continue to be mistreated today, and that the West is so often complicit in these abuses. And so it's worth comparing Ecce Homo with German artist Otto Dix's painting with a similar name. In Self-Portrait Behind Barbed Wire, Ecce Homo 2, Dix portrays himself as shorn, naked, and an emancipated victim of his country's concentration camps. By subtitling the painting Ecce Homo, Dix demands that his viewers behold what their nation has done to such men. It's impossible not to associate this painting's subject with the Holocaust. In contrast, while Wallinger's figure is still specific in its details, I think the milk-white color of the statue allows the viewer to associate him with any number of victims. And perhaps this is why Amnesty International, an organization campaigning for the release of present-day political prisoners, sponsored the statue's 2017 placement in the portico of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. In their press release for this exhibit, the organization states that the statue's Jesus is representative of the type of cases that we work on today. The press release also features images and descriptions of prisoners Amnesty is currently advocating for, including a Latino woman, a young African, a woman with bright red lipstick, and a Vietnamese man with a thin mustache. Somehow the stone-white figure of Christ contains all of these diverse people who share their humanity and their suffering with him. Thus, Ecce Homo makes a moral demand on its audience. Dormer understands this when he claims that the feeling of the work isn't so much religious as it is moral. This demand-making is something Wallinger wanted from his work, stating that his statue declares that's Jesus Christ, and we're going to be responsible for what happens to him. Because it places bystanders in the place of the condemning crowd, Ecce Homo forces citizens of London to recognize who they and their society are also condemning. And that's why one writer could describe the statue in these words. By bringing the figure of Jesus on trial into our midst, a man undergoing a trial by a brain mob, then execution and torture and the sentence of execution, we are also provoked into asking who we have become as people and societies, and who our victims will always be. Part 3. A heresy against secularism, making Jesus strange again. Through placing an explicitly religious figure in the heart of London, Wallinger is also disputing his nation's claim of public secularism. Wallinger has stated that Ecce Homo was quite a challenge to the normal order in Trafalgar Square, a kind of heresy against secularism. To understand what Wallinger means by that compelling phrase, a heresy against secularism, I think we need to examine the number of times he has contrasted his sculpture with the Millennium Dome, the British government's official celebration of the millennium. Wallinger has often expressed his frustration with the dome, calling it a worthless exercise and a missed opportunity to talk seriously about religion and majority faith in this country and how we should live. He claims Ecce Homo is an antidote to the empty celebrations of Mammon in the infamous dome, and an opportunity to address the elephant in the room of Christ's role in England's historic Christian faith. Placing the statue of Christ in central London is therefore a heresy for secularism, because it challenges the idea that England has moved on from its religious past, and because its depiction of a Christ who suffers in solidarity with the oppressed undermines secularist critiques of Christianity. According to Herbert, Wallinger's religious art aims to drag a nation's religion from periphery to the center. Now, of his own faith, you may be thinking through all these quotes that Wallinger is a Christian trying to make a public statement here, but he's not. He actually says, I'm an atheist, but I'm a Christian atheist, by which he means that his questions and his disputes even about faith and transcendence are shaped by the memories of Christianity. So through his art, he is attempting to show his country that this is true for them as well. As historian Jonathan Costell-Kate writes, Ecce Homo, the artwork, was a way of making Britain's putative religion as visible as possible, as if to say, here he is, behold the man whose teachings underpin your culture, your politics, and your society. As Wallinger has stated in another interview, the person of Jesus is a God who always arrives with the awkward question, do you believe in Jesus? Or in this case, do we? Wallinger's art forces his audience and himself to reckon with that very question. With Ecce Homo, Wallinger goes about this task by making the all too familiar image of Jesus strange again. Wallinger has twice identified this as his aim. In one interview, he says, I hope with Ecce Homo to make Christianity something that is too visible and present, something other that is feared because it isn't understood. Another time he stated, my intention was to make Christ or Christianity as other or threatening or strange as Islam is to a lot of people in the West. The comments from bystanders I quoted earlier, I think demonstrate that Wallinger was successful in doing exactly that. Wallinger takes Jesus seriously and shows just how troubling Christ's bold acquiescence to death by empire is. The statue demands a response that is in some ways similar to those provoked by Jesus' own way of suffering. Faith, truly this man is God's son, or rejection, if you're the Messiah, come down from this cross. So as a self-declared agnostic, Wallinger is an outsider to the Christian faith. Yet this outsider status grants him clarity into the identity of Jesus, a clarity that is much needed by those who claim to profess him. Perhaps this clarity comes from his own willingness to query his own unbelief. Lubbock claims that through his art, Wallinger's agnosticism is asked to doubt itself. I think the clarity of Wallinger's work is an excellent example of what another artist, Makoto Fujimura, calls border walking. Fujimura describes religiously curious artists as border walkers, who live on the edges of their groups, going in and out of them, sometimes bringing back news to the tribe. Fujimura claims that such artists offer cultural leadership in a new mode, serving functions including empathy, memory, warning, guidance, mediation, and reconciliation. Through Ecce Homo, Wallinger is doing exactly this. By exposing the contradictions of his fractured post-Christian country, Wallinger is nudging it towards a fuller and more holistic understanding of itself. So finally, the scandal of the incarnation, Jesus and the transformation of suffering. To put it in theological terms, what Ecce Homo makes strange is the very scandal of the incarnation, the belief that God came to earth not as an exalted figure, but as an ordinary human. Using blatantly theological language, Wallinger has explained his aims in creating the artwork. Essentially, I wanted to make a piece that had Christ as a human being, and I wanted him to be life-size because, well, he was made in our image. By depicting Christ as a life-size, contemporary, and all too human figure dwarfed by the surrounding hubris of empire, Wallinger is emphasizing the central tenet for Christians of the incarnation. God became a human like us. Writing about this artwork, theologian Rowan Williams draws from Soren Kierkegaard, who wrote in the 19th century that there was a sense in which all Christian theology and proclamation boiled down to someone saying to someone else, "Once God walked the streets as a human being. We simply know that it was true, and so everything is different." Wallinger's statue is exactly that, God walking the streets of London as an ordinary human being. Depicting Christ as life-sized and ordinary forces viewers to reckon with the human-scaled fragility of God made flesh. Scholar Rachel Wells understands this well when she writes the following. While representations of Christ have been made in a wide range of scale, Wallinger's use of the life-size, especially when created for a public square filled with adultery enlargements of state heroes, emphasizes the Christian doctrine of God's human embodiment. Christianity claims that salvation has been achieved through the very act that God should reduce God's self to become vulnerable to the actions of God's creation, that God should lower God's self to the scale of the human, that God should become life-size. Ecce Homo's scale emphasizes the humility displayed in such a voluntary movement. The statues around Ecce Homo depict humans who have enlarged themselves for their own glory, yet their names, General Napier, King George IV, Major General Sir Henry Havelock, are largely forgotten outside of history books. In contrast, Wallinger's statue depicts a God who has lowered God's self to the scale of the human, whose humility through God's identification with us has made him eternally relevant. The humility displayed in Wallinger's Christ does not just come from the figure's scale, but also from his lack of clothing and posture, with arms bound and eyes closed. Moreover, Christ is depicted in the moment just before he is condemned to death. When Orthodox theologian John Baer writes that Christ does not show himself to be God by becoming almighty, as we tend to think of this, it is rather by the all-too-human act of dying, he is describing what Wallinger is depicting, a Christ whose power comes from being found in the human form, humbled to the point of death, to paraphrase Philippians 2:8. The early church was well acquainted with such death, since many Christians were subjected to imprisonment, torture, and cruel death at the hands of the empire. Ecce Homo bears remarkable similarities to a 3rd century mosaic depicting one such martyrdom. Jesus in Ecce Homo and the figure depicted in this mosaic are both clad in towel-like loincloths, have their arms bound behind their backs, share precise details in their calf, shoulder, and arm muscles, and feature bare feet. These similarities suggest that the Christ Wallinger depicts in Ecce Homo shares something in common with those who are martyred in his name. In paintings and icons of resurrected martyrs, it's common for the instrument of their death to be glorified along with them, as a token of their victory over evil and death. So here we have Saint Demetrius, who was stabbed to death by he was a legionary, a Roman soldier who converted to Christianity and then was stabbed to death. And his spear, the instrument of his death, is glorified along with him. Now, in Wallinger's work, the means of Christ's torture, the barbed wire crown, is gilded with gold. Father Patrick van der Vost elaborates on this detail, describing the wonderful tension between the horrible barbed wire and the gilding, which already represents a certain element of redemption and the resurrection to come. Through this gilding, Ecce Homo suggests that the sufferings of Christ, as well as the sufferings of those who follow him, have a purpose that transcend the designs of those who inflict that pain. And this provides a further way of understanding why the statue honors the dignity of all suffering humans. Because Christ suffers as an ordinary human, he gives dignity and purpose to all who suffer in similar ways around the world today. It is this dignity which Wallinger depicts in the statue. Despite its frail humility, there is a quiet and confident poise to Ecce Homo. These hands rest calmly in their shackles, palms open, fingers relaxed, writes Cambridge scholar Rebecca Gill. When Amnesty International sponsored the statue's 2017 placement on the portico of St. Paul's Cathedral, then director Kate Allen declared, "It is unapologetically celebrates human dignity, which, though vulnerable, is non-negotiable and needs protecting. By representing the lives of others who suffer for the sake of others, Ecce Homo represents the continual possibility of the incarnation." As Baer writes, rather than thinking of the incarnation of Christ as an event restricted to a long ago past and a far removed land, we should instead think of it as a possibility that is to be lived in an ever contemporary reality, here and now, in those who respond to him. Those who suffer for the sake of others are partaking of this possibility by participating in Christ's incarnation. By way of conclusion, I'd like to quote Herbert's description of Wallinger's earlier religious work, Angel, to articulate yet again how this artist approaches public spirituality. In this conflagration of the mystical and the metropolitan, something discoverable on the street that expands to cosmic levels of inquiry, we might observe the joy and conception of worldly epiphany that permeates Wallinger's art. Quoting Wallinger, "Even if you don't get the Christian uplift from the idea of the Word being made flesh, the good news being given to people," he says, "there might be those kinds of little epiphanies available to people if they sharpened up their visions or saw things in a broader light. Such pragmatic thinking, reflecting upon the fact that within the human organism is a fundamental desire for transcendent meaning, is at the heart of Wallinger's engagement with spirituality." In creating Ecce Homo, Wallinger has taken the claims of Christ very seriously. He has quite literally placed something discoverable on the street that expands to cosmic levels of inquiry, an image of the Son of God. By so doing, he is allowing anyone who comes upon the work to encounter their own epiphany. How will they respond to this Jesus and his silent claims upon their city? That's it. Thank you for making it this far. If you have made it this far, maybe pop a comment or hit the like button. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this artwork and if it opened up any new ways of thinking for you. Thank you so much for listening.